Greetings. Welcome to Short Stories, a production of the National Taichung University of Science and Technology Language Center. Today we will hear a short story based on a character created by Carlo Collodi. I'm talking about Pinocchio. The Adventures of Pinocchio was published in 1883 in Italy and has been popular worldwide ever since. It is one of the most reiterated and reinterpreted children's stories. There have been countless films, books, plays, and TV shows based on this rascally wooden character. Why do we love this story so much? Maybe it's because of its timeless message. People who fail to grow up will always be someone else's puppet. If you are interested in watching a film adaptation of this book, I personally recommend either the 1940 Disney version or the 2019 live-action version directed by Matteo Garrone. The Italian actors do their own English dubbing, and the results are fantastic. Anyway, enjoy the story. Vocabulary: irascible, irascible. The older he got, the more irascible he became. Rascal, rascal. The young rascals liked to tease the old man. Marionette, marionette. Geppetto made a marionette out of a piece of magic wood. Impudent, impudent. The impudent child ran around the house. Jackass, jackass. Don't be a jackass. Cross the street briskly. Hitch a ride, hitch a ride. She hitched a ride with a coworker. Rowdy, rowdy. The rowdy children drove their teacher crazy. Pick up the slack, pick up the slack. Pinocchio decided to pick up the slack and get a job at a nearby farm. The story. Once upon a time in Florence, Italy, there lived an old carpenter named Geppetto. He was an irascible fellow. When he wasn't in his workshop, he was shouting at the local kids who liked to make fun of his wig. "Hey, oatmeal head!" they would yell as they threw stones at him. Geppetto would then chase the rascals down the street, waving his walking stick in the air. But the sad truth behind this anger was that Geppetto was lonely. He had so completely devoted his life to his craft that he never had time to get married and start a family. That would all change on one sunny morning. One day, Geppetto received a delivery of wood at his workshop. He picked through the pile to look for a suitable piece of wood for his next project, a marionette. Suddenly, he heard a voice say, "Please be careful." Geppetto scratched his wig and muttered, "Who said that?" After a moment of silence, Geppetto picked up a perfectly shaped piece of wood and began shaving it. "Ouch!" said the strange voice. "You hurt me." Geppetto dropped the log on the floor and staggered backward. "It's enchanted!" he exclaimed. The little log replied, "Please don't throw me into the fire." Geppetto was amazed and said, "I wouldn't dream of burning something as special as you." So the old carpenter went back to work, fashioning the log into a wooden puppet. He worked more gently than usual, which made the log giggle and say, "That tickles." Geppetto laughed and said, "I think I'll call you Pinocchio." When Geppetto was finished, he looked upon his work, a wooden puppet with a smiling face and a long nose. "I know what you need," he said, "a touch of paint." But before Geppetto could dip his brush, the little wooden boy snatched the wig right off of his head. "Give that back, you wicked boy!" he shouted. But Pinocchio just put the wig on his own head and stuck out his tongue. Geppetto chased Pinocchio around the workshop, but he could not catch him. Eventually he sat down on the floor, exhausted. I should have made him with shorter legs, he said to himself. I should have known better. Now I'm stuck with an impudent child. Geppetto wiped a small tear from his eye as he said this. After a few minutes of rest, the little wooden boy jumped down from the rafters where he was hiding and said, "Are you ready for round 2?" Geppetto got up and chased the puppet to the front door. The puppet opened the door and was running down the street in a flash. "Stop him!" shouted Geppetto as he huffed and puffed. A policeman was walking by when he saw the commotion in the street. The policeman caught Pinocchio and asked, "What's all this about?" Pinocchio, who was very clever, replied, "That old man is trying to kill me." The policeman was familiar with Geppetto's habit of chasing young boys down the street and said, "You run along home now. I'll take care of Mr. Geppetto." Pinocchio ran back to the workshop while the policeman arrested Geppetto for causing a public disturbance. While Geppetto was spending the night in jail, Pinocchio was rummaging through the carpenter's house looking for something to eat. He found a single egg, but was surprised to find a chick inside it. With nothing to eat, the puppet slumped down on the floor. "I'm starving," he groaned. "Serves you right," said a tiny voice. "Who said that?" wondered Pinocchio. "I did," shouted the small, chirrupy voice. Pinocchio turned his head upward and saw a large green cricket climbing up the wall. "I'm the Cricket of Wisdom," said the insect, "and I have a great truth to tell you." Pinocchio crossed his arms and said, "Well, get on with it then." "Woe to boys who disobey their parents," intoned the cricket, "for they will turn into jackasses." "Shut up!" shouted Pinocchio as he hurled a hammer at the cricket. The insect disappeared, and the little wooden boy was alone in a dark, cold room. He decided to warm himself by the fireplace. He pulled up a chair and rested his feet directly in front of the fire. It did not take long for him to fall asleep. Pinocchio was awakened the next morning by a loud knock at the door. "Let me in!" yelled Geppetto. Pinocchio tried to get up, but immediately fell flat on the floor. He looked down and saw that his legs had burned away during the night. "Father!" he cried, "someone has eaten my legs!" Geppetto climbed in through the window and found his little wooden boy sprawled on the floor, weeping. "Oh, you poor thing," he said as he scooped up Pinocchio in his arms. While Geppetto was making a new pair of legs, Pinocchio asked, "You got anything to eat? I'm famished." Geppetto pulled out 3 pears from his coat pocket and said, "I was saving these for my breakfast, but I'll gladly give them to you." Pinocchio took a long look at the pears and said, "I'll eat them, but only if you peel them first." Geppetto was shocked and incensed. "What? You just said you were famished. How can you be so picky?" Pinocchio crossed his arms and refused to eat. Geppetto, grumbling, peeled the pears and gave them to Pinocchio. The puppet ate them quickly and asked, "Do you have any more?" Geppetto shook his head and said, "All I've got are these peels." Pinocchio frowned, but then decided to eat them anyway. Feeling grateful, the wooden boy decided to thank his father with a hug. The next day, Geppetto decided that it would be best for Pinocchio to go to school. He went to the market and traded his coat for an ABC book. When he showed it to his wooden son, the boy exclaimed, "Thank you, father. I promise I'll be a good boy and go to school." Geppetto patted him on the head and packed his book bag. On the way to school, Pinocchio saw a big red sign that said, "Great Marionette Theater, 1 day only." "Ooh, what's that?" murmured the curious puppet. He diverted his course and headed straight for a colorful tent that was standing in the middle of a large field. When he reached the entrance of the tent, he was stopped by a surly, dark-haired man who demanded 4 pennies for the entrance fee. Of course, Pinocchio didn't have any money, so he sold his ABC book and bought his way into the Marionette Theater. He was amazed at what he saw. There were dozens of wonderfully decorated puppets dancing on the stage. Pinocchio couldn't take his eyes away as he shoved his way to the front of the crowd. He cheered and laughed and clapped his hands. After the show, Pinocchio was approached by a fox and a cat. Both were wearing tattered suits and hats. "Hello, young man," said the fox. "Our business partner, the director of this puppet theater, would very much like to meet you." "Who, me?" asked the confused Pinocchio. "Yes, you," replied the fox. "The director saw you in the front row, and he thinks you could make a fortune on the stage." Pinocchio thought about how poor he was and what kinds of fun things he could do with a lot of money. He followed the pair to the tent where the director conducted his business. The director offered Pinocchio a job, which he heartily accepted. The Marionette Theater traveled from town to town, putting on shows. At first, Pinocchio was pleased, but after a few days he was feeling very tired. "Please let me rest," he begged the director. The director just smiled and said, "Be a good boy and work for your money." Pinocchio never saw any money because it all went to the fox and the cat. The next night, Pinocchio refused to go on stage. "If you are no good to me on the stage," growled the director, "then maybe you'll be of more use in the fireplace." With those words, the director grabbed Pinocchio by the neck and flung him into a cage. "I'll deal with you later," bellowed the director as he stormed out of the tent. The poor wooden boy wept bitterly. He was sorry that he ever left his father, and he desperately wanted to go home. "I told you this would happen," scolded a tiny voice. "Cricket!" exclaimed Pinocchio. "You gotta help me out of here." The cricket harumphed and asked why he should do that. Pinocchio begged and said that he loved his father and that he was kidnapped by the director. "Your nose just grew an inch," the cricket said pointedly. "What?" said Pinocchio. "Your nose," explained the cricket, "grows every time you tell a lie. Now, which were you lying about? The 'I love my father' part or the 'I was kidnapped' part?" Pinocchio confessed that he was not kidnapped and that he had willingly joined the puppet theater. As soon as he said that, his nose returned to normal. "I'll help you," said the cricket, "but only on one condition. You must promise to never run away from home again." Pinocchio put his right hand over where his heart would be if he were a real boy and said, "Cross my heart and hope to die." That was good enough for the cricket. He hopped onto the lock of the cage and set the wooden boy free. Pinocchio ran as fast as his wooden legs could carry him. It was in the middle of the night, so it was pitch black, and the bare branches waved menacingly overhead. Pinocchio shivered and very quickly lost his way. He stumbled upon a road and decided to wait for the next passer-by to hitch a ride. It wasn't long before Pinocchio spotted a lantern gleaming through the murky fog. As it drew closer, he saw that the lamp was hanging on a wagon that was pulled by a team of donkeys. The driver's face was covered by a large scarf and downward tilted hat. Pinocchio tried to look inside, but could only see darkness. The wagon stopped in front of him, and the driver pulled down his scarf and said, "Come play with us. Come play with us. We're going to the Island of Toys." How could Pinocchio resist such an invitation? He was cold and damp and scared, and here was a chance to get warm and play with toys. Pinocchio hopped right in. "My name is Mr. Lampwick," said the driver. "You'll love the Island of Toys. All boys do." When they arrived at the island, Pinocchio was astounded at what he saw. It was an island that was almost entirely inhabited by boys. The oldest were about 14, and the youngest was 8, and these boys were all engaged in boisterous and rowdy games. Everywhere he looked, Pinocchio saw boys running, jumping, climbing, and fighting. It was like a crazy circus. "It's the middle of the day," Pinocchio pointed out. "Shouldn't these boys be in school?" Mr. Lampwick leaned close and said in a low voice, "On the Island of Toys, "There is no school." Pinocchio was overjoyed. "I'll stay here forever," he declared. Mr. Lampwick grinned. Several days passed. Pinocchio had no idea how long he had been there. All he knew was that this was much better than studying. But one morning his attitude suddenly changed. When he awoke on that dreadful morning, Pinocchio reached up to scratch his head. He discovered that his ears had grown quite long during the night. Not only were they long, but also hairy. "What's happening to me?" shouted the frightened puppet. A little mouse stuck her head out of the wall and said, "I know what it is. It's donkey fever. I've seen it many times." Pinocchio asked the mouse about this disease. The mouse explained that he had just 2 or 3 hours until he completely transformed into a donkey. Pinocchio gasped, but what came out of his mouth was a donkey's bray. He ran for the nearest exit and down to the shore. "I have to get off this island," he said to himself. "I want to see my father again." Pinocchio hopped into the first boat he found and started rowing. When he was about halfway to the mainland, he suddenly stopped. To his shock and horror, his hands had transformed into hooves, and he was no longer able to row. The poor puppet began to panic. He started kicking like a donkey, for in fact, he had completely transformed. "Eeyaw, eeyaw," he brayed. The kicking capsized the boat, and the donkey that once Pinocchio sank to the bottom of the sea. As Pinocchio was sinking, a large shark swam by and swallowed him whole. He lay inside the shark's belly, unconscious. But inside his mind, he was wide awake. He saw a beautiful maiden with bright blue hair and a flowery dress. She approached him and said, "Why are you crying, little one?" Pinocchio sniffed and replied, "Because I am a no-good rapscallion who has broken his father's heart." The woman smiled and said, "In my experience, no-good rapscallions do not weep for their fathers. You clearly have a good heart, Pinocchio. I should know because I am your mother." Pinocchio's eyes widened. "Mother?" he muttered. The woman knelt down close to the puppet and explained, "I am the Blue Fairy. I was the one who enchanted the log that your father used to create you. I did this because I knew that you both needed each other." Pinocchio jumped up and hugged her. But as he looked up into her great blue eyes, he felt sad again. "But I am a donkey trapped in the sea," he lamented. "How will I ever see my father again?" The Blue Fairy smiled and said, "Drink this." She handed him a goblet filled with bitter-smelling liquid. At first, Pinocchio refused to drink it, but the Blue Fairy kept coaxing him. Pinocchio took one big draught from the goblet and woke up. When the wooden boy woke up, he found himself inside the belly of a shark. He also noticed that his ears, hands, and body were all back to normal. He was a puppet again and jumped for joy. "But how do I get out of here?" he wondered. He began wandering around in the darkness, stepping over wriggling fish and digestive juices. He looked to his right and saw a faint light. As he got closer, he saw that the light was coming from a small candle resting on an old wooden crate. The puppet stepped closer and noticed that someone was sitting behind the crate. When he realized who it was, the little wooden boy's heart was filled with so much joy that he felt like his chest would burst. "Father, father!" he shouted as he ran to hug his dear old papa. The two were reunited once again. After their tearful reunion, Geppetto explained how he had ended up in the shark's belly. "When you went missing, I looked everywhere for you. I asked so many people if they had seen you. The last person I asked told me that you had gone to an island. I borrowed a boat, but I was stopped by a sudden storm. When I fell into the water, this huge fish swallowed me up." Pinocchio then enthusiastically said, "Now we can escape together." Geppetto shook his head. "It's hopeless," he said. "Nothing is hopeless, father. Follow me." Pinocchio grabbed the candle and his father's hand and led him to the shark's mouth. Upon seeing the multiple rows of jagged teeth, Geppetto exclaimed, "See, I told you it is hopeless. We'll never get past those." Pinocchio scratched his little wooden head and said, "I have an idea." He held the candle up to the roof of the shark's mouth. It didn't take long for the shark to start heaving and hawking, and then, suddenly, the shark sneezed, and the wooden boy and the old man flew out of his mouth and halfway across the bay. Pinocchio, being made of wood, and thus a natural flotation device, carried the old man the rest of the way back to shore. After a long journey back home, the father and his son were wearier than either had ever been in their entire lives. Unfortunately, Geppetto's age meant that he could not recover as well as Pinocchio. He became very ill and unable to work. Pinocchio decided to pick up the slack and got a job at a nearby farm. The little wooden boy worked hard every day to earn enough money to take care of his dear old father. After about 5 months, Geppetto began to recover. It was at this time that the talking cricket appeared once again. "Do you understand the truth that I told you?" asked the cricket. Pinocchio nodded and said, "I want to thank the Blue Fairy for helping. Do you know where she lives?" The cricket said that he did, as he and the fairy were colleagues. "Then give her this gift," said the puppet, as he handed the cricket a small bag filled with 50 copper coins. The cricket bowed low and then hopped out of the window. The following night, Pinocchio stayed up late to get some work done. At around midnight, he settled down in his little bed to sleep. As he lay there, he looked out his window into the night sky and saw a twinkling blue star. "I wish I was a real boy," whispered the wooden puppet as it slipped into a deep sleep. When he awoke the next morning, Pinocchio was shocked and overjoyed to discover that he had been transformed into a real boy. "Father, father," he shouted, "I'm a real boy." Upon seeing his son in the flesh for the first time, Geppetto leaped from his bed. The two hugged and danced like schoolboys. They only stopped when they heard a knock at the door. It was the postman. He handed Pinocchio a letter that was addressed to him. "It's from the Blue Fairy," exclaimed Pinocchio. He opened it and read the letter that was inside. It said, "My dearest Pinocchio, thank you for the gift, but I must return it because I think you need it more than me." Pinocchio looked in the envelope again and found 50 gold coins. "We're not poor any more, father," he shouted. Geppetto gave his son a kiss on the forehead and said, "I'm glad I made you." Pinocchio smiled and replied, "Me too." Questions. Number 1. What word best describes Pinocchio at the beginning of the story? A. Impudent. B. Obedient. C. Dutiful. D. Respectful. The answer is A. Impudent. Question 2. What was the cricket's message? A. The early bird gets the worm. B. Don't judge a book by its cover. C. Obey your parents. D. Don't invest in crypto. The answer is C. Obey your parents. Question 3. Why did Pinocchio run away from the island of toys? A. He wanted to go back to school. B. He caught donkey fever. C. He wanted to save the Blue Fairy. D. He was bored. The answer is B. He caught donkey fever. Question 4. Who saved Geppetto from the shark? A. The Blue Fairy. B. The Talking Cricket. C. Mr. Lampwick. D. Pinocchio. The answer is, of course, D. Pinocchio.